This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we talk with author, speaker, and Lutheran pastor Heidi Neumark. Heidi has served congregations in the South Bronx and presently in Manhattan. Her experiences in congregational and community leadership in the Bronx led to a highly acclaimed book, Breathing Space, A Spiritual Journey in the South Bronx. She has chapters and sermons in numerous other books and writes regularly for the Christian Century and other journals. In her present position, Pastor Neumark also serves as the executive director of a shelter for homeless LGBTQ+ youth. Her newest book, Sanctuary, Being Christian in the Wake of Trump, was released in 2020. Heidi adds her voice to the growing chorus of Christians calling for faith-based resistance to the Trump agenda. Sanctuary is an amplifier for the many voices crying out against policies and rhetoric that are cruel, dehumanizing, and dangerous. We talk about the many ways we can provide sanctuary in a world where many are seeking safety.
And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you may be listening. Welcome back to the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. I'm Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church here in London, Ontario.
You do it well. You do it really well. My name is Kevin George, and I am the priest at St. Aidan's Anglican Church in the northwest corner of London. That's where I hang out, often with a digital producer, but I don't know where he is.
He's apparently he's got class.
Okay.
Something you and I know nothing about.
Whatever. I have no class.
Right. I have no class. Today on our episode here at the Vicar's Crossing, we are really excited to visit with award-winning author Heidi Neumark. And Heidi is a sought-after speaker. She serves as a Lutheran pastor who has served congregations in the South Bronx, and presently she's in Manhattan, and she's going to be joining us from Manhattan in a few minutes. And her current book is called Sanctuary, Being Christian in the Wake of Trump.
Yeah,
and
God help him.
A copy of the book cover for those of you on YouTube looking over Kevin's shoulder there. So we'll look forward to chatting with Heidi here in just a minute.
Well, now is a good time for us to do our land acknowledgement. The Vicar's Crossing acknowledges that the land upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples, and are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and people with whom we wish to work together towards a time of wholeness and reconciliation between all peoples.
All right. And we also want to say hello and thank you to our wonderful sponsors here at the Vicar's Crossing podcast. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And many thanks to our good friend and supporter, Dave Mullen. And we say hi to everybody at A. Miller George today.
How's she going, Dave? Looking forward to a hockey game in the new year with you. I got an email about that. Did you get an email about that?
I did get an email about that.
Okay, that's great. Okay, good news. And it's my great honor to offer our thanks to Carol Basada and Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. You get on over there and she'll move your prescription from some big box outfit. And when you're done getting drugs from her, you'll look just as healthy as me.
Mm-hmm. And we want to say hi and thanks to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And our thanks to Tricia Lister and Molly Maid for being a supporter of the podcast. All right, Kevin. So Heidi's coming in a minute, but I can't believe how quickly the time has flown here.
Yep.
Really, I was just thinking about this the other day. We're in the middle of November.
Yep.
We're past the middle of November now.
Yep.
And we're coming near to the end of our season here at the Vicar's
Yep.
Crossing. We'll take a little break
Yep.
through Christmas and into the new year, and then pick things up again in 2022. But
Yep.
so we can't do the segment really that we've booked anybody right now, can we?
Well, I think we can. I think we can do one more. I think we can do one
we
more.
can squeeze one more in. Okay,
We can
so Kevin,
squeeze I'm ready.
Okay, ready?
Yep.
Kevin, who in the world did we book this week or maybe next year?
Well, Rob, am I ever glad you asked? Monday, we're going to sit down and interview Diana Butler-Bass and Michael Corin, and it's going to air on Advent 1 on the Sunday as a bonus episode, an Advent special about Jesus in the public square. Both of them have written incredible books this year in 2021 about Jesus. And both of them have noticed that as it relates to other books they've written, once you sort of name it to be a book about Jesus and about the image of Jesus, it's a little harder on the uptake in terms of interviews and so on. So we're going to have a really good conversation about what is it like to welcome Jesus into our midst for Advent. And so that's going to be a really fun episode, less sort of diving into a book, more sort of common conversation.
Right. And I'm looking forward to this because in a way we can kind of sit back and listen to them talk to each other, because often we're, worrying on talking to our guests and back and forth, but this will be good for us to sit back and listen to. So we hope our listeners really enjoy that, and that's going to be fun.
And the beauty of it is we're doing it on a Monday before Advent 1, and that way we can have our sermons for the Sunday.
There you go. It's all planned. We need all the help we can get. All right. Heidi Neumark is here from Manhattan. And I never like to leave people from Manhattan waiting. So let's bring Heidi in right now.
It's up to you, New York, New York.
And Heidi Neumark has joined us here on the Vicar's Crossing. She's in our Zoom room. And Heidi, we're so happy that you've joined us and could take the time to chat with us today. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
Well, great.
So
tell.
At first, I thought you were in London, England, but
no, we are the second most favorite London in the world for like 180 years running or something like that.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I'm excited to be with you in your London.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Now, for our listeners that are tuning in, and we always like to ask our guests just to tell us and tell our listeners where you are, so we can kind of get a hone in on where you live and what's going on down there.
I'm a Lutheran pastor in New York City in Manhattan. And I'm also the executive director of a shelter for homeless LGBTQ young adults in the church.
Great. Okay. Good.
Good old Manhattan.
Manhattan.
One day I'll get there.
I went to New York City years ago on like a class trip.
Yeah.
So haven't been back to that area for quite a number of years.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that wasn't yesterday, because it's been a while since you were in class, Rob.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it shows too. Yeah. So.
Well, you got there.
I'd love to host you. Let me know when you're coming.
All right, we'll do.
Yeah,
we'll want to be visiting Trinity. Definitely. So listen, to get started, before we get into the book, I noticed I thank you for accepting my friend request on Facebook, and I've been following what you're up to. And you just had, with the feast having just been upon us, a St. Martin lantern walk in Manhattan. I wonder if you can tell our listeners about that, about why it's important and what you did, because it looked absolutely wonderful.
It was wonderful, and it was the first kind of largest children's thing we've done since COVID. So it was especially wonderful. Well, I'd heard of St. Martin of Tours, but I'd never heard of any lantern work or any celebrations around St. Martin of Tours. And I learned about it from some German immigrant families with young children that have been part of the church. And there used to be, pre-COVID, 2 really large celebrations in the city, one in Manhattan and one in Brooklyn, but they haven't had those for a couple of years. So then we decided to do a smaller one. Martin of Tours was born in 316, and he was his father was a Roman soldier, and it was expected that he would become a Roman soldier as well when he was 15. In fact, it was the law. But he had started going to church against his parents' wishes, who they followed Roman gods. But anyway, he had to join the army. And then the kind of famous story about him is he was on his horse with his troops, and he saw a poor man who was shivering in the cold, and he took out his sword and he sliced his heavy cloak in half and gave half of it to this poor man. So it was kind of a swords into plowshares. He used the sword to provide warmth and shelter for the poor. Eventually he was baptized, and he said, I can't follow Jesus and be promoting the violence of the Roman Empire. And he was put in prison for cowardice, which is kind of ironic.
Oh, yeah.
He was put in prison. He was released at the end of whatever war that was. And he eventually became the Bishop of Tours. And he fought he used his position as bishop to fight against incarceration, and many people were freed because of his efforts. So there's this, I never had heard of this, but in Germany it's quite a thing, I guess, a big children's celebration where they follow St. Martin on a horse on this lantern procession in the evening, and singing special St. Martin songs, and then have treats at the end. So we didn't have a horse, but we had a donkey.
All right.
No, that's close enough.
Yeah, Broadway.
On Broadway, you had a donkey on Broadway?
Yep. No, I'm sorry. Actually, we had a pony.
Oh, pony. Well, fair enough.
Anyway, it was a lot of fun.
Probably turned a couple heads.
It turned a lot of heads.
Yeah. So, well, there you go. Well, look, I found it fascinating. And I thought, well, this is something our listeners should hear about, because I'm sure a lot of people don't know about it. Actually, the parish, my wife is a Roman Catholic, and she grew up in a parish here in London, Ontario called St. Martin of Tours. And so I think she knows some of the history of this. Like when I was telling her about it, it was like, oh yeah. And, but for me, it was all brand new as well. So I was like, wow, that's really incredible. So, and good to see things happening, sort of as we evolve out of COVID, whatever that looks like, or I don't know if we're out of COVID or we evolve with COVID or what.
I think we're evolving with COVID. It's how I'm seeing it right now.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
Listen, let's talk about the book, which is called Sanctuary, your most recent book. I have to say that I first came upon your writing about your experience in the South Bronx in breathing spaces, and it was amazing to me. Breathing space, sorry, it was amazing to me, the book, because it really spoke to just the way that you brought your own sense of self, because it really is a memoir, and your own sense of hospitality to that place, but the hospitality that was offered to you in this book, and the subtitle here is Being Christian in the Wake of Trump. The idea of being sanctuary really sort of takes the fore, and the many ways in which not just our buildings can be sanctuary, but we ourselves can be sanctuary for others. And again, it embraces that radical theology of hospitality. The book is a marvelous testimony in many ways to how we can do that. And through your own experiences and that of your community, which is, as you said, Trinity Church in Manhattan, you give the reader incredible insight into the importance of communities being places to welcome, places of safety, of love, of healing, of forgiveness, of renewal and support. The first chapter of this book takes up with the story of King Herod. And you actually, what I love about this book is it goes through sort of the seasonal church year, which is really neat. Throughout the book, you draw comparisons between Trump. Sometimes we refer to him here as he who shall not be named, but Trump and the powers of the empire as outlined in Scripture. And in the opening chapter, you described a scene inside Trinity Lutheran Sanctuary. You described a Three Kings pageant, which was performed just a few months after the 2016 presidential election, which I can't even imagine how that must have all felt for you guys, especially in New York. Casting the villain became a no-brainer. So with a blonde wig, a congregant played Herod and used Trump-esque lines and tweeted them out. You point out in the book that, well, only God knows the details of the depths of former President Trump's spiritual life, What he says and does publicly disavows every core teaching Jesus set forth in the Sermon on the Mount. Your opening chapter is really a call for the church to do something we don't talk about a lot, which is take sides. You point out that, quote, the time for being nice and passive, fretting about causing offense, and fiddling over mild and non-threatening proclamations is long past. While we equivocate, lives hang in the balance. Yeah, and I really love this a little bit. You described the future of the church to be in cages with children. The future of the church is profiled and choked and left dead on the street. The future of the church is hiding under a school desk and in a nightclub bathroom as bullets fly. The future of the church is with a Black transgender woman mocked and shot in the heart. The future of the church is in the belly of a whale, stuffed with plastic garbage and lying lifeless like the body of a dead migrant child, washed up on the shores of the Rio Grande. If the church is not in these places of crucifixion, the church is not with Jesus. And if the church is not with Jesus, we are lost and we have no future. Boy, when I read that, I was like, wow, this is, give me more of this. This is amazing. Can you say more about the call for us to stand against the herods of our day and to come alongside of the most vulnerable and not be shy about doing what Jesus did in the sense of clearly articulating God's favor for the poor?
Well, I really do believe that that lives hang in the balance. And Jesus clearly calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus loves all people, and yet identifies with those, like people that I named there, and creation. I was hungry and you fed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I mean, that's how Jesus identified. In terms of, it's interesting, avoiding division. I mean, obviously, we want people to connect with one another. We don't want to promote division, but I think in naming these things, we're not promoting division. We're just acknowledging what exists. Jesus's very first sermon, he points out a marginalized widow from Zarephath. He points out a Samaritan leper as places of God's grace, and then what's the reaction? That people want to throw him off a cliff. So Jesus was often very divisive, but ultimately for the sake of healing, and you can't have peace without justice, I guess, and we see that very clearly with Jesus, that being reconciling is the ideal, but not at the cost of justice and human life.
Yeah, we used to hear this a lot. Rob and I often talk about how being at this age of our lives where we've been hanging out in the church forever, we forever heard about rights for LGBTQ people in the church, right? I don't remember it not being a topic, right? And one of the things that kept coming back to me, and that is, I'm even just reading this, and what you just said is, people often talk about unity as how it somehow trumps justice, right? So we'll take peacefulness and unity over the cost of the rights of God's beloved, right? It's shocking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see our shelter for those, our shelter, I see young people, who kill themselves, young people who think God hates them. We worry about, well, if we say this or we do this, then people will leave the church.
Yeah.
But what about the people who aren't even in the church because they feel so rejected?
That's right.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So from where I'm sitting right now in my home, I'm looking out the window and I'm seeing signs of the upcoming season out my window. So we wanted to ask a question about Christmas a little bit. You described something that your church did for a nativity scene that was really, really fascinating and interesting. This was done post-Trump election, where your worship team decided to place the family figures in the nativity scene in a dog cage among the candles and the holiday poinsettias, and with the baby Jesus separated from his parents and covered in foil to resemble a tiny mylar blanket. And while the people in your community appreciated these connections between the Christmas story and current events. Certainly, you describe an appearance on Good Morning America, which got you some interesting feedback. Right? There's no doubt with Christmas coming up on us that most people would certainly prefer to stick to kind of the veneer of harmless generalities when speaking about Christmas. But as you say in your book, there's no blood, no dung, or mother screaming in labor or loss. We don't like to focus on children slaughtered by Herod, gunned down in school, or dying in immigration custody. So I wonder if you could share with our listeners today a little about the feedback you received from fellow Christians, and perhaps a word or two about, where our hearts really probably should be focusing as we get ready for Advent and then Christmas coming up.
Well, I should say first, in terms of speaking on Good Morning America, to my mind, was not highly, I can't think of the word, but I didn't talk on Good Morning America about children in cages,
Right.
And that, that we had a nativity scene like that. What I did do was mention the very biblical truth that the baby Jesus and his parents became refugees,
Right,
in Egypt, fleeing Herod. I mean, that story is right there in Matthew. And I literally, and the thing I said that I think really upset people, probably also the word refugee, except that's really just right there in the Bible.
Yes, right.
Yeah, it's kind of there. Yeah.
Was that, when I saw the refugees at our border, I saw Jesus and his family.
Amen.
Well, I mean, I was probably not a pastor. I was a political operative,
Yes.
an actress, a liar. I was playing make-believe. And then it went really
dark.
Yeah. I don't like to use the word dark because,
Well, I suppose, yeah. But what I mean is,
really, yeah. But I likely was a pedophile who preyed on little children.
Yeah.
Or even worse, I was a guy in drag.
Yeah.
I was Henry, not Heidi. I mean, it was just very hateful, very hateful. Threatening letters. Yeah. And that was only for saying nothing about Trump, nothing about churches, that Jesus was a refugee.
So how do we coming into Christmas and do that business of, the detention of that?
Well, I think really focus on the Christmas story and try and pray for the Holy Spirit to open our eyes to see how this story connects with our lives. I mean, there's God in a very vulnerable baby, in a child in a manger, which is certainly not an elitist, privileged position. The shepherds out in the fields, who weren't even allowed to testify in court in those days. I mean, they were kind of, the shepherds were undocumented. The shepherds were not counted in the census. I mean, everyone's going to be counted in the census. Why weren't the shepherds there?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Of course, then the family becomes refugees. Herod's violence. If you just dig into the story itself, you can see all of these things, and also see that God comes in the midst of our imperfect messiness, which is encouraging, to me. I hope it's encouraging.
Definitely to me.
Oh yeah, big time. Big time.
I would say focus on the story.
Yeah.
And let the story open our eyes to these things.
Exactly. And as we talk about sometimes here too, is letting that story and having a conversation with those stories, and a conversation with Scripture, and a dialogue with that, to unpack some of these themes that we were just talking about, and because that can be very revelatory in many ways, and very healing as well. We were taken by the image too of poor doors. Wanted to ask you about that. This was something new for Kevin and I, certainly. You write about the high cost of housing in Manhattan and the lack of affordable housing. And this is certainly an issue that we here in London, Ontario, and really major cities across Canada are dealing with on multiple levels as well, where developers are incentivized to make a certain percentage of low-income apartments in their developments. But as you make clear in your book, there's often little or no really goodwill involved here. One of the developers' application included a provision that the people residing in the more affordable apartments would have their own separate entrances to the side or to the back. And these are what had become known as poor doors. That's where that comes from. Wow. And so you write this in the book. According to one spokesperson for the luxury developer, quote, "No one ever said that the goal was full integration of these populations," unquote. Well, the one who stood on a hillside and said, quote, "Blessed are you who are poor," might have actually meant that. But what he did know about 21st century New York real estate, like, what did he know about that? So can you tell us a bit more about these developments and maybe what some of the folks in your community who live in low income housing are facing right now?
Yeah, and the reason for the housing mix in these luxury developments is if they provide some lower income housing, not even low income, but middle income housing, then they get a tax break. So that's what they're doing it. And then, but those people can't mix with
so they end up like Trump paying like $700 of tax in a year or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're housing these poor people that have to go in a separate door, and they're not allowed to use any of the amenities in the building. Wow. Well, yes, how the cost of housing here, as in many places, is pushing people. They're being edged out of the housing market. Places to go. In New York City, people may go and try and find housing in poor areas that are still not gentrified, that still don't have luxury housing. Those are areas where the buildings themselves can be unhealthy because their landlords don't take care of them properly. There can be mold, there can be rodents. There are areas with inferior schools, with increased health problems because of the housing, but also decreased health care. And then it creates more homelessness.
Yeah. We're just in the midst of an Advent series coming up here with Brian McLaren in our deanery. And last year we had Nadia Bowles-Weber with us. And last year we began this relationship with a group here in London called Indwell. And they actually work to build affordable housing. It began as a Christian organization, and they leverage monies donated, but with government funding. So every dollar we give as a deanery will be multiplied by 10. So part of our Advent response is around that. But again, the stories are shocking. I mean, like there are people who move into this city now, they have no way to afford to buy a house. I mean, it's just, forget about low income. It's middle income can't get there. Nobody can get into a house.
Yeah.
So it's a big issue.
Yeah. One thing, I don't know if I talked about it in this book, Sanctuary. I talked about it in Breathing. I think I talked about it in Breathing Space, but I don't remember how I came across this story, but there's a story about the building of, in the Bible, of the building of Jericho. And King Ahab oversees that, and killed his 2 young sons and buried their bodies in the foundation of the city, which was a practice at the time of foundation sacrifice. And it makes you think of all the lives and children whose lives are sacrificed by the development in our city.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the more compelling images in this book that leapt out at me was this. You describe standing in your church and seeing the sight of looking up and seeing behind the altar, which is usually reserved for, us ordained folks and trained lay people and so on. And seeing there a couple of transgender women. I wonder if you could share that story with our listeners and a little bit about the Red Umbrella Project that you have and the power of that image that you witnessed that day in your sanctuary.
Sure. Just a small correction. They were not transgender women.
Oh, okay.
They were sex workers.
Sex workers. Sorry. Yes.
Not transgender sex
yes.
workers.
Yeah.
But, well, the Red Umbrella Project, it's not of the church, but I was asked by them at the recommendation of a member of the church who was a former sex worker who knew this organization. They work to work against violence against sex workers and promote human rights for sex workers. And they were having a memorial service for sex workers who'd been murdered in the past year. And they were looking for a location and approached me if they could use our sanctuary to have this memorial. And we, said yes. And at the last minute, I thought I had we'd organized what they needed, but they had asked for a table to be set up front, and I'd forgotten that. So when they arrived, it was like, where's the table? And the table wasn't there. And I just said, well, you can use the altar. The altar is a table. They were somewhat shocked about they could use the altar, and then they had little votive candles, one for each person who was murdered. And there were a lot. And so they just, they spread all the votive candles over the altar and stood behind. Two of the women who were leading it stood behind it as people were, reading out the names and ages, and in some cases, place and date of death. And it was in the evening, and these candles were glowing, and these two women were standing behind the altar. And I just thought, wow, and this is how it should be.
Yeah. Want to talk about a Eucharistic image? I mean, yeah. I guess I should read these things. In my notes, it says, and I read the book, Sex Workers, Not Transgender. Sorry. More coming on that, though. The other thing that sort of strikes me, and you described this in the book about your own experience, but I think if you read anyone who reads your books, it becomes clear that you are an incredibly good listener. These stories that come forth from you are a testimony to the fact that you listen and take them in. You describe your impulse towards listening to marginalized voices stemming from what you call inherited trauma. You write in the book, for as long as I can remember, I've been drawn to voices that many others ignore, deny, or stifle. You discovered not so long ago that you were descended from German Jews on your father's side, people who were hounded in pogroms and murdered in camps. You write about this in your last book, Hidden Inheritance. The profound gift of listening you have has led you to make decisions clearly about proximity. And just reading the book, it struck me that you made a decision, influenced by people you heard, to go to Argentina and learn. You made decisions about where you would pastor, whether it was in the South Bronx or now in Manhattan, but you've positioned yourself in places in proximity with those who are really on the margins. Can you say more to us about proximity and listening and its importance in helping us bridge our divides in this world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to listen to people from a great distance. Not impossible, but actually in college, I took a class where we had to read Martin Buber, and I remember, Buber talking about I-thou relationships versus I-it relationships.
Right.
And, the not listening to people or not really getting to know people in a more meaningful way, it's easier to objectify them, to project on them your worldview, what you think, rather than really being open to the other. And then in my case, if you're a more privileged person, then you're projecting your view on, kind of objectifying everybody else. So yes, I think it's part of our humanity, not for other people, for ourselves to open ourselves to listening to the other. And that is a priority for me. I mean, a gift. It's a gift that when people trust to open themselves.
Right. Yeah, it's sacred space, isn't it? Often talk about listening, sitting and listening to people and their stories, as opposed to wanting to talk and give them an answer for things. That's always sometimes the gut reaction is to start talking back, right? And saying all those important things, but sitting in that sacred space and letting God do a little work in there too, that never hurt.
No, I had an incredible experience last week. Like many churches, we are now in person and online, right? It's a hybrid both.
Yeah.
And some of the people who worship with us online are scattered around the country or around the world. But there was one person who was referred to worship with us online by one of her, a professor, actually an English teacher who's a member of the church. And I realized, and this woman is in the Bronx, which isn't that far away. And so I went to the Bronx to have lunch with her. Like I would get to know a new member of the church who was coming in person. I thought, oh, here. So I never met this person in person ever.
Yeah.
I didn't even.
Interesting, isn't it?
Huh?
I say it's so interesting, right? This is the world we live in now.
It's so interesting. And in her case, I could, get to see her. So I sat down and, I can't go into the details, but she starting at age 5, she just had a horrific life. And she grew up Roman Catholic and identified as a butch lesbian. And she said one day the priest came to her and said she was going to hell. And she stopped going to church. I mean, she just had a horrible life. And somehow she felt a sanctuary in this watching online. And she said, my wife, who has nothing to do with organized religion and runs a grocery store around the corner from our apartment, she arranges her schedule to run home, have lunch at 11 early when the service is on. So she runs home and watches it and then runs back.
Awesome.
And, but literally I just sat there for an hour listening to this woman. She didn't eat her lunch. I ate my lunch. She didn't eat because she didn't stop talking. But it was such a gift of connection.
Well, it's striking because at least, I mean, there's got to be 2 or 3 examples in this book alone where colleagues or friends or people from somewhere across the country feel comfortable to hook you up with somebody that they know, because they know that the people they love or care about who are going to come to you are going to have a listening ear, I believe. I mean, it's just very clear that people feel comfortable moving people towards you because it's sacred space.
Right. Very much so. Yep. And so speaking of listening, it's good to listen to stories and stories of others, as we've just said. And this book is absolutely full of stories, which bring so much hope. And one of these stories was about a little child named Charlie, who was grieving the loss of his brother, Jakey. I'm wondering if you could recount his story for us and the potential that stories like these have to lessen the distance between, the racial structures that we have built and the kinds of injustices that result from a lot of those divides.
Charlie was 5, and when his 15-month-old brother died of a congenital disease. And Charlie, obviously, this was devastating for the whole family. And Charlie, they kept coming to church, and Charlie would kind of hide behind his parents' legs. He became very clingy. We had Sunday school at the time. He didn't want to go to Sunday school until one Sunday he decided he was going to go to Sunday school with his father nearby. And there was a seminarian that Sunday who had prepared the lesson, and the lesson was on Tabitha. And she's telling the story of Tabitha's death and the widows who are mourning around Tabitha and lifting up to Peter the tunics that Tabitha had made for them. And then Peter raises her from the deathbed. And in the middle of telling the story, the teacher, her name is Sarah, she suddenly said, "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. What's Charlie's going to be wondering why Jesus didn't bring his brother back to life. I shouldn't be telling this story today. Why didn't God answer his parents' prayers?" And then just Charlie, who had been speaking for weeks
Mhm.
in church, started to tell the classmates that his brother died and his brother was with Jesus in heaven. And he had this woven bracelet that he wore, that the family was wearing, that to remind him of his brother, and it
Mm.
was like the women showing Peter their woven tunics. And
Mm.
every kid in that class was just like riveted listening to
Yeah.
Charlie. And then this
Yeah.
little girl, and her actual name is Paradise. Paradise stood up and goes over and gives him a hug.
Mhm.
And then one by one, every child got up and hugged Charlie and his father. Now,
Wow.
um, Charlie was a very pale skinned blonde child, and Paradise was a very dark skinned black child. And, uh, on the one hand, um, kind of feel good moments like that are not enough to dismantle racist structures. Um, and the divisions and injustices that children face. And in fact, I wrote in the book, superficial diversity can be dangerous because it can create a sense of progress, that isn't real. Oh, look,
Mhm.
we're all one happy
Yeah.
family, and then we
Mhm.
Yeah.
not look at how bad things are and work to change them. But I do think that just as listening to people, being close to them, multiplying moments of proximity like that and of shared experience and closeness does matter.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, so yeah, that moment really struck me like that.
Mm.
Another really moving story in your book is that of your mom
Mm.
when she joins your congregation. Your mother was living with Parkinson's at the time, and just getting to church was obviously a big challenge. Could you share with our listeners the story of her joining your congregation and how you reflected upon that in light of the Trinity? And the Trinity is described by Leonardo Boff as, present in time under shadows and crosses, at the end of time in the form of full openness and unending celebration, so close that we do not perceive it, so transcendent that it overflows on all sides, so intimate that it dwells in the depths of our hearts, so real that it persists despite in all of its perverse consequences. Can you share a little bit about your mom and your mom's story there?
And what a beautiful piece of writing by
That's
Leonardo.
gorgeous.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Love it.
And it's translated. I mean, he's
Mhm.
Brazilian, and yeah. So my mother lived with us the last 2 years of her life, and really lost a lot of her mobility and some of her mental agility as well. But and so she was joining the church, and another woman named Luceli was going to join the church. She had lost a child to meningitis, and at a time when she was having a lot of feeling that she was making bad choices with men. And so
Mm.
she felt this was God's punishment that she would
Mm.
lose a child.
Mm,
And she blamed herself. And this had happened almost 40 years ago. And she was
okay.
still blaming herself,
Yeah.
not able to really forgive herself, not feeling worthy um, to join a church even. Um, so, when Boff talks about shadows and crosses,
Mm.
she was certainly experiencing that. And my mom, I mean, my mother could hardly get ready for church. And then I was at church myself, but my daughter and husband are helping her, and she starts crying that she's going to be late. I mean, she was feeling
Yeah.
her disease, shadows and crosses herself. And then,
Yeah.
they're both there, and Luceli sees, that sees my mother's weakness really, and need in that moment. And she takes her hand, and they're standing there holding hands, joining the church. And I mean, they're so different. My mother, comes of a position of privilege, and Luceli does not. And she's from the Dominican Republic.
Mm.
My mother is white, and there they are confessing their faith, and, we all rejecting evil. And it just it was a beautiful moment of just the church is named Trinity, but a kind of a Trinitarian grace of a glimpse of our mutuality, our need for one another, one not existing without the other. Yeah, to me that was a Trinitarian moment. And then we had Tres Leches cake.
Okay, perfect.
Well, you can't go wrong there. But
No.
I just and that whole chapter, by the way, and the talk of the Trinity as community, right, was just, I gotta say, it just really was. I use the word liberating for me, because sometimes I really struggle with some of the conversation the church has around the Trinity, and I just found that, and the theology of Boff around that, and that beautiful piece, just so liberating. Like, it was like, yeah, Trinity as community, as lived relationship.
Well, because I'm pastoring a church called Trinity, and there's like several of them in Manhattan. There's Trinity on the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
There's Holy Trinity. We get often mixed up with that because it's like a 40 blocks from here, but we're the not the Holy Trinity. I also have always had trouble with the Trinity. I mean, thinking about it or talking about it on Trinity Sunday. We're supposed to be on the Trinity.
Yeah.
And, there are all these ridiculous metaphors like water, ice, and steam. So I've spent a lot of prayerful time reflecting and thinking on the Trinity, and that's kind of what that chapter comes out of it. Probably if I was at a different named church, in fact, when I was almost 20 years in the Bronx, the church was named Transfiguration, and I had never really gotten a lot out of the story of the Transfiguration, but when I was there, that became a very meaningful story as I delved into it. So I think that for me, that happened with the Trinity too.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's just really good. I keep waiting on Trinity Sunday for someone to stand up and scream, "Heretic!" But it hasn't happened yet. But who knows? But I having read this chapter now, I know what next Trinity Sunday is going to sound like. So anyway, look, this coming Sunday, speaking of big days, is the feast of the reign of Christ, or as some call it, the feast of Christ the King. You point out in your book that over time has not been your favorite Sunday in the church's calendar either. You point out that there's many beautiful visions of Jesus, right, that are far better than King. And the image of King seems very misplaced when laid upon Jesus, because of course he took such a different bent. But you write that when Trump became president, you changed your mind about Christ the King Sunday. You also point out that the children like to compare the Christian right like to compare Trump to King Cyrus, who became the first king of Persia in the 6th century BCE. Now, if you've watched the news at all, you've heard all of this over the last few years, but the identification of Trump as the king of Cyrus enables the evangelicals to overlook his apparent lack of evangelical piety, since Cyrus too was a non-believer anointed by God as an instrument of salvation. In Jesus, we're given a decidedly different image of what it could be like to reign or to be king. With this Sunday coming up, how will Trinity Church Manhattan, not the unholy Trinity Church of Manhattan, how will you keep Christ the King this Sunday, this year, and what are your reflections on this feast now, given where we are and given where the United States is in this sort of post-Trump presidency? I won't say post-Trump era, because it seems to be continuing to be like a terrible wet blanket over.
Oh, it is.
It's terrible.
And I mean, he could be elected again. Absolutely.
Scarily enough, yes.
Oh,
yeah. Well, this year I have to say, we don't have anything special.
All right.
And it happens. My intern, it's her turn to preach this Sunday, so I don't know what.
Okay.
I don't know what direction she's going. We do have some new members joining the church this Sunday who are all young adults, and I think they're joining the church because I know one of the reasons they're joining the church is that they appreciate the connection between things that they care about and in their lives and in our common, in the public square, and the church, and the voice of the church. And I mean, Christ the King Sunday is actually a very anti-fascist Sunday. That's how it started. I forget what Pope started it when Mussolini and Hitler were rising, and to kind of counteract that and say, wait, you know, Jesus is king, not you guys. So I'm not sure though exactly how it's going to play out this year. In terms of what was the request?
Well, I just in terms of how you're feeling now. I mean, it's sort of Biden's in now a bit. There's still a lot of trouble at the border and so on and so on. And I just wonder if there's some reflection now on how we continue to sort of remember who we see as king, because we can often put our trust in, you know, Democrat, Republican in the United States, or over here, whether it's New Democrats or conservatives or liberals or whatever. But often as people of faith, we get dragged into something that allows us to forget whose it is we are in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think when it was begun, it was in the 20s. That was the point. I mean, that earthly rulers, we need to hold them accountable to what, you know, how the world should be. We need to hold them accountable for their actions, and at the same time take comfort in the fact that that they're not the ultimate authority, that the ultimate authority, you know, rests with in Christ, and who uses that authority for love and for promoting life.
Right. Heidi, wanted to wrap up our time together, asking you and talking a bit about the southern border, and we know you spent some time there, and when you were there, you witnessed you know, both incredible acts of kindness as well as incredible acts of meanness on multiple levels. And recently hearing about the arrest of people like Scott Warren, people might recognize that name from news stories, a volunteer who was leaving water for migrants. He was arrested on felony harboring charges. Hearing stories like that it's infuriating.
Madness.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we could finish today by having you share some of the stories of what you witnessed on the border, and most particularly about worship at the border, and the sharing up of the peace using pinkies.
Pinky peace.
Yeah, pinky peace.
Yeah, well, let me tell you about that. I was at the border with Tijuana. I was in Tijuana, Mexico, and there was a place there called Friendship Park. It was named Friendship Park because at one point, people from the U.S. side and the Mexican side could freely meet at Friendship Park. I think it was just on the weekends, but they could freely meet there. They could picnic there. They could just spend time together in this kind of this sanctuary, almost safe space on the border between the United States and Tijuana. Then came Operation Gatekeeper, it was called, and you could no longer meet. They set up a wall, but with big slat openings, so people could no longer meet at picnic together, but they could pass family photos. They could actually share food through the spaces of the fence, and so they could kind of stay eating on either side with each other. They could hold hands through the border, that, you know, touch a loved one, kiss a loved one. Then a new mesh fence was added, so people could not do that. It had very tiny, tiny holes in it so that you couldn't pass even a piece of paper. But at that point, people could still walk up to that mesh fence and see each other through it and talk to each other closely through it. And that lasted until 2009, when the Department of Homeland Security constructed on the United States side a second parallel fence with barbed wires and sensors and surveillance cameras. So it was like a no man's land between the two sides. So you couldn't go up to the fence. There was another fence quite a ways away separating you. So you could hardly even see people gather on the other side. They were so far away. So the border church has worship there every week on each side, with a pastor on each side. and a leader on each side hooks up their phone to a loudspeaker so you can hear what the people on the other side are saying.
That's incredible.
So at the opening confession, how it started, everyone I was on the Mexican side, so we could go right up to the fence.
Right.
We're invited to put our hands on the hard metal slats of the wall, and just kind of, you're feeling that cold embodiment of the sin that divides us. And then the pastor invited everyone to, look up at the sky where there was no fence. And as he offered words of forgiveness, he said, "En el cielo no hay muros." In the sky, there are no walls.
Wow.
And also in Spanish, the word for sky is also the word for heaven.
Oh, wow. Wow.
It was very moving. But communion was real. So for communion, each side had a little portable altar. And so one side did the words for the bread, and one side did the words for the wine, and
Wow.
communed at the same time. But my favorite part, which you referred to, was the sharing of the peace.
Right.
And when it came on my side of the border, the congregation was told to share the peace using only our pinky fingers, like this, which I thought was kind of weird. But like everyone was like doing that. I just thought odd. And then afterwards, I asked about it, and the pastor explained that during the brief period when people could still get up to the fence, but there was this mesh that you couldn't pass anything through, divided families and friends could touch the tips of their pinkies together. And they called it the fingertip kiss, or the finger. And so now the border church, every week when they gather, they remember that moment in time by sharing the peace with their pinkies. And for me, it felt like such a powerful way to think about the importance that even small connections can have across all the structures and systems that would keep us apart. And it's very hopeful, because you want to make major changes, but sometimes, but that the small connections matter too. And that was a really beautiful moment.
Yeah. Incredible sign. Yes. As I was picturing that, I saw it as a sign or a symbol of something extremely powerful and holy. Yeah.
Yes.
I wonder too if you can share a little bit, actually not on the notes that you have in front of you, but just thinking about that. You're when you came back from the border, you brought some I love the liturgical stuff that you guys are doing, and so you brought some interesting liturgical art to bear on Lent, I believe, around the border. Can you share a little bit about that? Because I think for those who listen to us who are in sort of church land and liturgical land, I think it's a really powerful image.
Yeah, so people, and really were engaged, with, they kind of sent me there. So with my experience, and wanted to learn from it, and wanted to kind of bring it into our sanctuary. And so in preparation for Lent, a group of people took a photograph taken of one section of the wall, and we bought these, I don't know, like room dividers, or quite large, and people painted them. There were two of them, and people painted them to identically look like that section of the border wall. And then for Lent, we put them on either side. Our baptismal font's in the back of the church, so we put it on either side of the baptismal font, so that you kind of had to walk through them to get into the church. And the font, we put a barbed wire around it as a reminder of the fence. And we filled it with sand for the desert, but we put a bowl of water in the sand. And so we had an opening confession related to the walls and things that divide us, including that specific wall. On Easter, people, as we entered the church with our opening hymn, kind of danced the two sides of the wall away. I find that, we can get used to seeing the things that are in church all the time, like the cross. I mean, the cross is such a incredible, is our central image.
Mhm.
But it's easy to just it's just there.
Right.
And
Right.
so trying to do things to, open people's eyes to see it in a new way.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, Heidi, we're really thrilled that you could take a few minutes and talk to us about all this today. It's wonderful stuff. And
I'm so thrilled to be here and to know what you're doing, and this kind of conversation you're offering people. Thank you.
Well,
Well, thank you. That's great.
When it comes to like the sort of our stick is, faith, the intersection of faith in the public square. When it comes to that, your life and witness and your ministry, as they've been shared with us through your memoir and this book and your hidden inheritance and in everything I see you doing online and everything else, is a real testimony to what can be done when we bring our faith to bear on our public engagement. And we're thankful for people like you and what you do, and we're very grateful that you gave us some time.
Well, likewise. Well, thank you very much.
All right. And Heidi Neumark's book is Sanctuary. And we're going to put a link on our website for our listeners to check that out, thevicarscrossing.com. There's the book there. And you can order it through there or find it at a local bookstore near you. And we always encourage our listeners to support your local stores and do that. Okay. So, hey, Heidi, God bless. Thank you. And we look forward to chatting down the line, we hope.
Great. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Heidi. And looking forward to getting into that book, which I'm just getting my hands on now, and look, that'll be some good reading, definitely. Yeah. Sanctuary. So check it out, folks. Okay. So that wraps up another Vickers Crossing podcast, Kevin, and we're looking forward to another show coming up real soon. So please keep us in mind when you're looking for podcasts, and come back and join us.
Who we got next week, actually, Rob, is Will Willimon. Remember from all those books we're reading in seminary and stuff? My goodness. Big shot.
Still go to Will Willimon sometimes to read his sermon.
I may be saying that wrong. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, he'll correct us.
Okay.
Thanks to our sponsors again today, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. To Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Ian's not here, so I'll say from Ian, see ya.
Yep.
But I'm here, and I'll say from me, Rob Henderson, Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London, see ya.
Goodbye.
And remember, Kevin,
yes,
to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Okie dokie.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!